No, I'm the Director of Science Operations at the Ocean Exploration Trust. This video will present to you the preliminary results of the Eastern Pacific Workshop. Please note you can view this video after the call today, and that more information about what I'm talking about is available in our report. A link of that is in an email I sent you, as well as on the Hangout website. So please make sure you use this to augment the information I'm going to tell you right now. I'm going to share my screen with you so that you can view the presentation of the workshop results. And I also wanted to point out that this pre-recorded video allows us to view your questions as you have them about what I'm talking about. So please feel free to type your questions or comments into the chat window as I go through this video of results with you today. There were two breakout groups at the workshop in December. One was based on discipline, and one was based on regions. The first groups, the discipline-based groups, were centered around the areas of archaeology, biology, geology, and physical and chemical oceanography. We asked that the participants in these groups come up with about 10 questions that they wanted to address with exploration in the Eastern Pacific. From these 10 questions that each group came up with, we then asked them to come up with different locations that they could go to address these questions. So you're viewing a map right now on the screen that shows the locations of white papers, and we asked people to put their own white papers aside and kind of look at more holistic questions that they wanted to address in the Eastern Pacific at large. The archaeologists came up with 5 different questions that centered around the hubs of maritime activity, known naval battle locations, and known or suspected wrecks. They recognized that the Pacific Basin is much larger than the area that the ships are currently operating, and so looking at things like trade routes weren't going to prove as fruitful as targeting some areas where there are known wrecks or known battle locations. So from that, they came up with these 5 questions. They wanted to look at the patterning of wrecks around key ports to see what that can tell us about the development of Pacific economies and intercultural exchange. They also wanted to look in near-shore sites for submerged prehistoric settlements that can be used to discern things about the post-glacial maximum coastline. The next question is development of techniques. So how can we look at the detailed landscape of an underwater battlefield and deep water archaeological sites to reinterpret historical events using forensic evidence? Then they wanted to address human discard and potentially identifying sites in the Pacific that can speak to the archaeology of discard and the environmental impacts of these sites. And finally, they wanted to see if we could find archaeological evidence of pre-European Asian contact at Eastern Pacific sites. Based on these 5 questions, they came up with 9 different locations that they would like to explore, including American Samoa, where there's the Clipperton aircraft and the approaches to the major port of Pago Pago, the Battle of Midway in Hawaii, where there's the sunken battlefield, including the USS Yorktown, Pearl Harbor, Hawaii, where there are known wrecks, including submarines and also ordnance dumps, the coasts from Washington, Oregon, down to California, where there are also known shipwrecks and perhaps submerged prehistoric sites, and finally, the coasts of South America, including the major ports of Lima, Peru, and Valparaiso, Chile. The biologists came up with 6 key questions that really centered on looking at the diversity of habitats in the Pacific and their interconnectivity. They wanted to address both protected and non-protected areas and pristine and human-impacted regions. The key points of their questions are exploring the connectivity between sites, exploring the adaptive capacity of an ecosystem, and looking at the management challenges, particularly with regard to global climate change. So their 6 questions are what the distribution of biodiversity in the water column and on the seafloor is in the Pacific, what biological baseline information is required to effectively manage these regions, what are the large-scale biogeographic boundaries of the deep Pacific, what are the successional patterns of deep sea communities following various perturbations, how are the biological systems interconnected in the Eastern Pacific, and how can natural environmental gradients in the Eastern Pacific help inform organism and ecosystem adaptation to global change? Based on these 6 questions, they identified 17 locations and 2 transits for exploration. These areas mostly focus along coastlines and tectonic margins from Alaska to Chile, also around major island groups or chains, including Cook, Pitcairn, Line, and Hawaiian Islands. Other areas include the Chatham Bank off of New Zealand and the Tonga, Fiji, and Kermadec region. And finally, to cover the sort of unknown area in the Central Pacific Basin, they also recognize that we're going to be transiting large distances between many of these specific sites of exploration. So they wanted to be sure that we planned our transits in a fashion that made sense for exploration. And in doing so, they planned 2 transits, one at the equator, bouncing north and south of the equator, and one in the southern Pacific. The idea of these zigzag, non-linear transits is to allow us to explore a variety of different areas that we normally wouldn't target with an entire expedition, but to allow us to take a stop at some of these locations and actually put the ROV in the water and characterize some of these unknown sites. The geologists came up with 10 different questions, and these focused on the submarine hazards, including volcanism and tectonics, and also understanding large-scale geological patterns. So their 10 questions are, what are the controls on fluid flow, including tectonics, volcanics, and sedimentary processes? What are the characteristics of submarine geohazards, and how do they relate to tectonic setting? Their third question focuses on examining the controls on submarine volcanoes, including why they form in certain locations, how they change and erupt over time. Their fourth question looks at examining the patterns of marine mineral resources and linking these to tectonic settings and oceanographic processes. They also want to explore the characteristics of plate boundary intersections. Their sixth question is how submarine processes impact the global climate. They also wanted to identify and characterize the geomorphic provinces of the Eastern Pacific Basin. Related to that, how would one go about creating a geological map of the Eastern Pacific? And then how would you find and potentially look at the cosmic impact structures in the Eastern Pacific? The scientists expressed that they believe that there must be many of these, but they're obviously difficult to find. If we came across one, perhaps opportunistically, how would we examine them? And what would they tell us? And then finally, what are the relationships between ecosystems and geological processes in the Eastern Pacific? Based on this, the geologists came up with 12 different locations, and these locations really focused on some of the major geologic features. So, for example, trenches, exploring the Samoa and Tonga trenches, among others. Island arcs, including the Cook Islands, French Polynesia, Hawaii, the Aleutians, and the Galapagos. Margins, particularly active margins in Cascadia, California, Central America, and near Chile. And ocean ridges, including the East Pacific Rise. The chemical and physical oceanographers came up with a list of 14 questions that they would like to address. The first focus on some chemical components of the ocean, so exploring the oxygen minimum zones and their impact on ecology, looking at nutrients, their sources and sinks and distributions, and why nutrient desertification is happening. A more physical oceanography-based question centers on how large-scale currents, tides, and upwelling processes interact with geological features and how they impact them. Also, although we do exploration for a very short period of time, maybe understanding where we are in an El Nino or La Nina cycle can help us understand or put a snapshot picture together of an ecosystem during these large-scale climate phenomena. It was discussed that we know very little about abyssal currents, so knowing more about abyssal currents and how they flow, where they flow, their strength and changes over time is something that's very important. Also, looking at the distribution of cold seeps in the region and how far from the source can they be detected. Where are internal waves generated and where does that energy go? Questions about noise in the ocean. What are the ambient noise levels and how does this vary through time and space? Measuring the impacts of ocean acidification through the water column and improving our ability to measure pH in situ. So there's this question of incorporating better sensors to do this and working with engineers and scientists to improve this measurement. Why are there vertical seamounts with flat tops and very steep sides in the Pacific and not elsewhere? Also exploring the chemistry, including mineral and nutrient distribution around hydrothermal vents. How much garbage goes into the Pacific garbage patch and what is the extent, the volume, and the distribution of garbage in this patch? And one final human impact on the ocean is what is the fate of the Fukushima radionuclides and can they be used to trace deep water circulation? From these questions, the chemical and physical oceanographers identified 10 different locations, and these are mostly areas that intersect with other discipline-based breakout group research, the biologists, geologists, and archaeologists. These locations include islands, the Cook Islands, French Polynesia, the Line Islands, Hawaii, Aleutian Island Arc, the Kermadec, and Galapagos, as well as margins from the northern US down through Mexico and the Gulf of California and central Chile. So based on all of those discipline-based breakout groups, this map is showing you the overlap between them. And you can see that there's quite a bit of overlap. And so our goal for the region-based groups was to go from all of these different discipline-based groups to more focused discussion on where can we actually do exploration that covers multiple disciplines, multiple topics in 3 different areas. So we came up with the regions from the map on the left, and you could see them on the map on the right. The red box is the Northern Pacific area. The blue boxes are the Eastern Pacific area, and these yellow boxes are the Central and Southern Pacific area. And so for the region-based breakout groups, people were able to discuss specific cruise locations within these larger boxes. The Northern Pacific group identified these areas as specific areas of interest along the Aleutian Island arcs, around Hawaii, off of the Vancouver, Canada coast, and areas off of the US and Mexico coast in Baja. The Eastern Pacific group identified several areas where cruises could be carried out, including the Galapagos region, regions off of Lima, Peru, and Chile, regions off of Mexico, and in the East Pacific Rise area. Finally, the South and Central Pacific groups focused on doing exploration in the Kermetics and Tonga, Fiji area, as well as some exploration off of the smaller islands and seamounts to the north and east. The results of the workshop shown here, the combined results are 33 high priority target areas. There are 25 specific locations and 8 different transits. We think that including these transits are important because, as many groups pointed out, there are going to inevitably be long transits between specific expedition locations. So being able to periodically put the ROVs in the water or use the mapping systems to characterize these largely unknown areas will provide a great data point where there is nothing known currently. So our goal today is to have you take the results that were just presented along with the more detailed information that's available in the report and discuss as your interests are within the various breakout groups. Please feel free to write into the chat and also to put your edits on our report. The final report will be available around January 30th. So with that, I'd like to thank you for listening and welcome everybody to our discussions.